everybody, it's Holly here today with a new video for Marker Pop. We're going to be using this Woodland Wonders set from Avery Elle along with the creative cuts for our main images. And then we're also going to be using some Ken Oliver color bursts to create a background. So I'm going to start out with a piece of watercolor paper, and I'm using a piece of Canson watercolor paper, and I'm just spritzing water onto the center of the cardstock. You could also just wet it with a paintbrush. And I'm just going to tap the color onto the card or the piece of cardstock, and then I'm just going to pick it up and move it around, and this will help me spread the color around where I want it. The color bursts are like a powder or a granule comes out, so as you drop it onto the water it just spreads really good and it's very pigmented. You can also use a paintbrush like I did here to kind of move the color around, and then I'm just going to give it another little spritz and move it around until I get it where I like it. And then I'm going to go ahead and use my heat tool to dry that. The best way to dry these actually is just let it air dry, but you can move it around a little bit more with the heat tool. And I'm actually going to use this as a background, so I'm not looking for anything specific. I'm showing you there on my hand how there's ink on my hands. With this being a powder, it does tend to get all over your fingers and your work area, so you want to make sure you're using a mat or doing it in a box or in a place you don't really care about there being a mess everywhere. I do a lot of hand washing when I'm using these in between and cleaning up my area because I tend to always have stragglers of the color bursts on my hands, and then I go to touch some white cardstock and it gets all over it. So once that's dry, I'm going to dab it with a paper towel to make sure I don't have any spots that are really thick. And I'm just going to set that aside and go ahead and get started with my stamping. And I'm going to use the regular Misty, and I'm just lining up my images so they'll fit on the piece of Nina Solar White cardstock I'm going to use. So I can just stamp them all at once. And I haven't stamped this, used this set yet, so I'm going to go ahead and stamp it with some Memento Tuxedo Black ink. And on my first impression it comes out kind of light, so I need to go in and stamp it again, which is the great thing about the Misty tool. Then once I have that second impression, it's perfectly just the color I need it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our coloring, and I'm going to use my Copics, and I'm going to start out with W00, W1, and W3 for the tree. And I'm just starting out by going with the lightest to the darkest and then working backwards. And I'm just adding some shading along the edges and then over the little dash lines in the birch. And then for my leaves, I'm going to use YG17, YG09, and G07. These are tiny images. I use 3 colors, but you really could just use 1 or just use 2. And I'm not going in and adding any great detail. I'm just quickly adding some color with a little bit of a highlight. And at the end, I realized I really didn't need to color the whole thing because only a portion of it is showing in my final project. So up next, I'm going to color the butterflies, and I'm going to use YR12, YR07, and YWW for just a tiny little bit of yellow. And then I'm going to move on to the little owl, and I'm going to use E13, E15, and E18 on the body. And then for the feet and his little beak, I'm going to use E11 all by itself. I'm off camera there, I'm sorry about that. E18 is my darkest color that I'm using for the highlights. I like to go up and go down in my colors and then go back in with the darkest color to really put in that shading that you want. And then you just let it air dry on its own, and it kind of blends on its own. And then for the banner, I'm going to stamp one of the sentiments that come in the set on it. But I decided to leave it white, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of shading on the banner with C0, C1, and then my 0, the colorless blender, to blend it all out. And I'm just adding that around the edges. And then I'm going to stamp the sentiment on with some black ink from W+9. I really like this ink because it's nice and crisp and it's very dark. I decided to color the banner first, though, before I stamped it on, because I wasn't sure how well it would work with my Copics. I don't believe it's Copic friendly. And then when I'm all done with that, we're going to go ahead and die cut them with the coordinating dies, and I'm going to run that through the Big Shot. And while I was doing that, I also die cut a piece of white cardstock with the Creative Cuts from Mama Elephant called All Prettied Up. And that's cut to fit the front of a card, standard A2 size. And I also trimmed down the piece, the watercolor piece that I did with the color burst. And I used the ultramarine blue is the color I used for the color burst. I trimmed that down so it would fit behind that scallop border. And I'm just going to kind of figure out how I'm going to create my scene with my little characters here. I'm going to go ahead and add some dimensionals behind the banner. The banner is going to sit on the outside of the circle. And then I'm going to put the tree and the rest of the images within the circle. You could add a piece of acetate to the front of the circle, and you could create a shaker card with the background on this too. That would be really cute. And I'm just going to add some tape runner adhesive to the birch tree to adhere that behind the circle. Then I'm just going to trim off any excess that's hanging over. And then I'm going to glue down the background so that that blue piece is sticking out behind my scene. And you can see I'm using some paper there to make sure I don't touch it with my hands. So it's going to glue that down with the HEG gun so everything's flat. And then I added dimensionals to the other images in my scene. I'm going to go ahead and add them down. Oh, actually, I folded a piece of cardstock, top folding gray cardstock. And then I'm going to add some foam adhesive to the back of that panel with my images. And then I'm going to adhere that to the front of my card, which is just your standard A2 size. Jumping ahead of myself here. And I didn't add any sequins to my card. I kind of wanted to keep it neutral where it wasn't super fancy, glittery or glitzy, so I could use it for a masculine or a feminine. So once I have that on the front of the card, I'm going to go ahead and add the little owl and the butterflies. The owl is popped up with dimensionals, and then the butterflies are just glued down directly onto the card. And then I'm going to take some clear Wink of Stella, and I'm going to add that to the butterflies, and then I added it to the leaves on the tree. And that pretty much completes my card for today. So thanks for stopping in. I will see you next week with a new video. Have a great weekend.